Good afternoon and welcome. You're listening into today's topic of interest, hosted by BDO Wealth Advisors, where we focus on the US elections, Biden versus Trump, who will win the Tony. I am Ricardo Teixeira, Chief Operating Officer for BDO Wealth Advisors, and it is my pleasure to be your host and moderator for today. In the run-up to the US election, there's always a level of excitement and emotion that gets bandied about in investment media and news headlines around the world. A lot of the reports, though, are political, focus on the investment impact on offshore and local investment portfolios for you and I. Making investment decisions is all about having context to the environment and circumstances that you face. It is vitally important to distinguish between what's interesting and what matters when making an investment decision. Our role as your financial planner is to help you and your family sift through the noise and clutter to get to the right solutions and make good decisions so that you can live a life of meaning and purpose with the money that you have. Our guest speaker today is an investment professional. He is currently Chief Investment Officer for Celerity Investments, a boutique discretionary fund manager, and he has in excess of 20 years investment industry experience as a chartered financial analyst with both local and global investment experience. Besides being so well qualified to deal with matters of finance and investment, he is also very well read, has a vast general knowledge of a wide range of subjects, and he even has a great sense of humor, which overall makes him a very interesting person to talk to. So please welcome a rather well-rounded investment professional who is perfectly positioned to unpack the impact of the US presidential elections on your investments. Please welcome Andries Coetzee.
Thank you for those very kind words, Ricardo. I really appreciate that. You introduced me as a professional, and I suppose a synonym for that is an expert. And as we roll into the first slide, I think it's important to note that experts learn more and more about less and less. In the end, we end up knowing everything about pretty much nothing. Not so. No, I really enjoyed preparing for this presentation today and delve into the mechanics of the US presidential election. Now, 2020 has brought with it many challenges that this world has not faced before. It's not only the spread of the coronavirus, the treatment of COVID-19 and the worldwide economic lockdown that we had to deal with. Global trade wars and the long drawn-out Brexit, combined with unprecedented fiscal and synchronized monetary stimulus around the world, overshadowed the increase in natural disasters linked to climate change. Add to that the cancellation of so many sport and cultural events that bring balance and joy to the world. And we can be forgiven for wishing a swift and peaceful end to this year. That, alas, won't be possible. With the advent of social media, political developments often have a sphere of influence far beyond natural borders, and this has never been truer for the US election. Tomorrow, more than 250 million Americans will be eligible to vote for, among others, a new president. It's likely that at least 140 million of them will submit a ballot paper in person, or many have done so via mail or in person before tomorrow, in order to pick the president of the largest economy in the world. If we can roll on to the next slide, I want to use the Tony Awards as an analogy for this investment. So many of you would know that the Tony Awards has got a full name of the Antoinette Perry Award for Excellence in Broadway Theatre. But like sort of Tonys for short and US election for short, there is a lot more to the US election than just picking the next president. And it is a bit of a show. Those of you who followed it in the newspaper or social media or on television, be it Fox or CNN, would have seen the show over literally the last year. But before we delve into the show and perhaps who will walk away with the Tony, let's quickly look at our two nominees. I got a picture of them on the next slide. And I thought those of you who were around in South Africa in the 80s would recognize that wagging finger. I suppose they also looked at some historic footage of erstwhile Prime Minister P.W. Botha. But I got this nice picture about these two gentlemen. So Joseph Robinette Biden currently aged 78, served as the 47th vice president under Barack Obama. That followed 6 terms of being the senator for Delaware. So in order to be a senator serves a 6-year term, and he had 6 of those terms, which meant he was a senator for 31 years. In that time, and specifically when he was vice president, he was very active and took the lead on many pieces of legislation in the US government. So he's got a long and illustrious political career and have been involved in politics from the tender age of 31. Interestingly enough, he told his first wife that he'll become a senator at the age of 30, and as I said, he did so at the age of 31, and then after that, he'll become president. It has been a very long wait, and only time will tell if this will indeed happen. Moving on to the gentleman, and I use that word very loosely, on the right-hand side, Donald Trump is the 45th and current president of the United States. And before entering politics, which happened fairly recently compared to Biden's political career, he was a businessman and, as you well know, a television personality. Interestingly enough, Trump and his businesses have been involved in 4,000 state and federal legal actions, including 6 bankruptcies. Now, given that Biden is a lawyer by trade, wouldn't it have been fascinating to learn that Biden actually represented him in one of those 4,000 cases? That's, however, not true. So if you do hear that, check your facts. Trump became the oldest first-term president in the United States when he became president in 2016 at the age of 70. Given that Biden is turning 78 this month, if he becomes president, he will, by some margin, be the oldest first-term president in the United States. Another interesting factoid, and this you can check, it is indeed true, is that neither of these 2 candidates ever did military service. Biden, due to asthma, and Trump eventually, and it took him a few years to convince authorities that this is indeed the case, due to bone spurs. Another important thing to bear in mind, and that one could have held in the back of your mind when you watch their television debates, and certainly as results come out, is shown on the next slide. Remember that light travels faster than sound. That's why some people appear bright until you hear them speak. On more serious matters, let's move on. A very important question is why these elections matter outside the United States of America. What we show on this infographic is the annual economic output, the gross domestic product of the world expressed in dollar terms. So that's essentially the total earnings, total sort of production of the world in any one year and the proportionate contribution from every country. So as you can see, the large pink bit is the United States, and they produce almost 25%. So essentially $1 in every $4 of production is produced by the United States. So that certainly matters. Their political environment eventually drives a large portion of the world economy, and that's why their election matters. To put it into context, China produces about 1 in every $7 of economic output. If you add Japan and Germany together, it's about 1 in every $10 of output. And those of you with good eyesight, if you look to the right-hand bottom of the screen, South Africa is there producing about 1 in every $250. So it's a contribution nonetheless, but not particularly significant in this setup. And that's a portion why, or one of the reasons why, the US election results matter around the rest of the world, because they still remain the economic powerhouse as it stands. But let's get back to the actual election. On the next slide, you'll see that the US, or the 2020 US election, will not only be the selection of the new US president. There are 2 more components, very important components to that. The first one is that they will re-elect the whole House of Representatives, and then also 1/3 of the Senate is re-elected every 2 years. You may recall that I said a senator has got a 6-year term, so every 2 years, 1/3 of them come up for re-election, whereas the House of Representatives, the whole House, is up for election every 2 years. When we move to the next slide, I want to show you the difference between, just very briefly, what it takes to become a representative and what it takes to become a senator. So in the House of Representatives, there are 435 of them. Remember this number, 435. You are elected for a term of 2 years, and the whole House is up for election every 2 years. You have to be at least 25 years old, and you've had to live in the US for at least 7 years. To become a senator, and there are 100 of them, 2 per state. On the House of Representatives side, that's almost, not quite, but almost proportionate to the population size of every state. But you do have a state like Wyoming, which has got just over 250,000 people per representative, whereas in California, it's almost 700,000 people per representative. So it's not quite linearly aligned with the number of people living in that specific state, but roughly so. Moving back to senators, there are 100 of them, 33 of them are up for election this year, and they have a 6-year term. You have to be at least 30 years old, and you need to have been a US citizen for at least 9 years. In both instances, you need to live in the state in which you stand. Moving on to the criteria for the actual president. I'm just going to focus on the top left-hand side of the slide. 3 requirements are key, and you may recall, those of you who followed the Obama presidency or presidential campaign in 2007, 2008, may recall that there was an issue about his birth certificate and whether it was an actual birth certificate from the state of Hawaii, because you have to be a natural-born US citizen. So if you weren't born in the US, sorry, as it stands, you won't be able to become the US president. Interestingly enough, if you go to the official US government website, they start off with a one-liner saying many people want to become the US president. What's fascinating though is they can only pick one of 2, but when they pick Miss USA, they pick 1 out of 50 possibilities. It's a funny place, this United States. Either way, to become the president, you need to be at least 35 years old. You need to be a natural-born citizen from the US, and you need to be a US resident and have had to live there for at least 14 years. Moving on to the next slide, I want to delve a little bit into the mechanics of how you become the president. So those of you based in South Africa will know that the president is the person that gets the most votes. So it's on a proportionate electoral system. So in South Africa, the popular vote, or the person that gets the most votes, becomes the president. In the US, it works differently. As it stands, in 48 of the 50 states, there are electoral college seats. These are the total members of the House of Representatives, as well as the total members of the Senate. So you may recall those numbers, 435 and 100. It gives you 535 electoral seats. And then the District of Columbia, so Washington, D.C., through legislation which was ratified in 1960, got another 3 seats in the Electoral College. So that's where the 538 seats come from. But let's take California on the bottom left of that brown map that you see there. You can see California's got 55 Electoral College seats. And if the Democrats, and it's been a Democratic state for a long time, if the Democrats, if Joe Biden had to win that one, he does get 55 votes in the Electoral College. There are 2 exceptions, as I said. The one is Nebraska and the other one is Maine, where they have a proportionate approach to this. But for the other 48 states, there are indeed, you win all of the votes. Interestingly enough, there is what they call a faithless Electoral College member. So what happens is the 538 votes is represented by 538 actual people. They then get together at some date in December and elect the next president. Now, in 31 of the states, they cannot vote anything else but the official candidate that has won that specific state. But in some of the states, you can actually vote for somebody else. So there was one of the previous elections where Colin Powell got a few votes instead of Hillary Clinton. There was one of the Indian chiefs in North Dakota that got a vote. And these voters, or sort of Electoral College members, are then called faithless Electoral College members because they don't stick to the party line. But many, as I said, in most states, you actually don't have a choice. If you're an Electoral College member, you vote according to the outcome of that specific state. So let's assume that all 538 votes will go according to the total number of Electoral College seats in each of the states that you see there. That means that in order to become president, you need to get 270 votes. So in the coming days after tomorrow's election, when you watch on the TV, they will be showing, and if we can go to the next slide, they will be showing how many electoral college votes there are. Sorry, before we get to that one, just a quick detour. We keep on talking about the Democratic and Republican Party, which are by far the biggest parties. I spoke about 250 million voters in the US. I just highlighted that there are some other parties, in this instance, the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, and the Constitution Party. But in terms of number of registered voters, it is below 500,000. So compared to the 240 million voters, these parties are very small, and it's really just a two-horse race. This is what typically takes place in an election like this one, or in an election foundation like this one, which we call first past the post instead of the popular vote. Moving on to the next slide and getting back to the actual election. What you will see, just one more, producer, if you don't mind. What you will see over the next few days is this map. So whether it's Fox or CNN or Sky or whichever your preferred website is, you will see at the top there the 538 total electoral seats. How many of those have already been won by the Democrats and how many have been won by the Republicans? And in this instance, this is based on one of the polls. You can see a lot of red in the middle. That's the Republicans. A lot of blue on the sort of closer to the coast and the lakes. It seems the Democrats like water more, so that's all blue. And then we've got the brown ones: Florida, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, North Carolina, Virginia, Ohio, and Indiana, some of the battleground or swing states. And that's also where these candidates would have spent a lot of time in the last few months and weeks trying to win those states. Moving on to the next slide. What's interesting is that the ballot paper itself is not governed by the federal government. So all 50 states have different ballot papers. This instance is one of Mississippi, which is very clear. It looks quite basic, but it's quite clear. But it's interesting that there's not a national ballot paper. Each ballot paper is governed by the laws of the specific state. So not on a federal level, but rather on a state level. I think that's enough about the actual workings of the election. So you now know that there are 538 electoral college seats up for grab, typically on a first past the post basis. So if you win the state, you get all the seats. So how does it actually, what does it look like? What are the chances of a Biden or a Trump victory? In order to do that, we're going to go to the polls, and then directly after that, you can flip onto the next slide and show what it looks like at the moment. So I'm going to show you 3 slides. This first one is just the current chance of a Biden victory. So what this sort of analyst company does is they look at a number of reputable polls, sort of dozen and dozens of them, put them together. They then run them through about 40,000 simulations and get a sample of 100. But those of you who remember the movie Groundhog Day remembered that they woke up on the same day and sort of had the same day over and over again. So what then happens in this sampling is they pick 100 samples. So let's assume we wake up the day after the election. 89 times of that Groundhog Day, Biden has won. 10 of the 100 days, Trump has actually won. So there are instances where Trump wins the election and one actually gave 270 electoral seats per candidate. It doesn't mean that it's a foregone conclusion that Biden will win, but you can just see that there are many more instances that Biden is likely to become the new president than what there are in terms of Trump. And obviously surprises can happen. But as it stands, and if somebody put a gun to my head, this is what I would guess. If we move on to the next slide, just want to show the number of electoral votes. So this is now how the 538 votes will go. And you can see it's a very, very clear victory for Biden, according to most of the polls. So 348 versus 190. Once again, it doesn't mean it's a guarantee. It just gives you a sense of what the statistics are telling us. And then lastly, the popular vote. And if we look at the popular vote, you can see that Biden is up at 53% and Trump at 45%. If I remember correctly, with Ronald Reagan in 1980, he got more than 55 or 56% of the popular vote and had a landslide victory. So you don't need 60 or 70% of the popular vote to have a landslide victory. You just need about 54 or 55. And that's really where Biden stands is at the moment. So it does look, based on this, as if Biden could win the election. In the last few minutes of my presentation, I want to talk about the investment impact of such an election win. Now, there was a slide earlier where I said it's not only the president that's being elected, it's also a third of senators and the whole House of Representatives. It's very likely that the House of Representatives, where legislation is prepared, will have a majority of Democratic seats. It may also be that the Senate turns from Republican to Democratic. And that may lead to Biden actually being able to push through a big portion of his agenda, something that Barack Obama could not do in 2008 or 2012. What we see on this slide, and I'm just going to focus on taxes and wages for now, is that Biden is likely to reverse some of Trump's tax cuts that we saw before. What happened is under Trump, corporate tax came down from 35% to 21%. That was a significant cut, and Biden suggests to take that back about halfway, so from 21 back to 28%. That obviously will have a knock-on effect on earnings on companies on the S&P 500. If we can go to the next slide, I just want to talk about how markets and reactions go hand in hand. What's happened in the past, if markets went up for the 3 months prior to the election, the incumbent party won. Okay, so that's the Republicans. If markets came down in the 3 months prior to the election, the incumbent party actually lost. This would indicate a Biden election. Now, once again, there's a lot of lies, damn lies, and statistics in all of that. But as it happens, the S&P 500, the very broad US equity index, is just about flat over the last 3 months. So it's very difficult to say, but this is what's happened. Another interesting thing that I came across is that many investors are saying, look, but under a Republican president, the markets will do well, and under a Democratic president, they will struggle. So if we go to the next slide, I want to dispel that myth. We can see under that one, and we've got a blue line and a red line there going back to Roosevelt in 1936. But under Republican presidents, markets actually did worse than under Democratic presidents. There are, however, two caveats. The one is under Clinton, from 92 to 2000s, markets did particularly well. And then in the next 8 years under George W. Bush, with both the 9/11 attacks as well as the global financial crisis, markets did particularly poorly. So if you take those two outliers out of it, there's really no difference in market returns between a Republican president and a Democratic president. So I'd be very careful to position an investment portfolio based on that. But let's assume now, just for the moment, that Biden wins, as we saw in the polls earlier. What does that mean? And if we can go on to the next slide, just focusing on taxes. As I said, it's likely to then cut earnings of companies on the S&P 500 by about 8%. So the expectation is that the market could pull back by about that level, especially if the Senate also turns to the Democrats, because it means he can actually get his legislation through. And you can see that communication services, healthcare, consumer staples, and technology are likely to suffer more, but something like utilities, real estate, and energy less so. What's interesting, though, is that many money managers called the outcome of the election wrong in 2016. They thought Hillary Clinton would win. But they then said that even if they knew that Trump would win the election, they would not have prepared or positioned their portfolios in the right way to benefit from what happened in markets after a Trump victory. So I'd be very careful to make any changes to investment portfolios based on what's going to happen tomorrow. Long term, this could actually be good for emerging markets if Biden indeed wins, right? So some capital flowing out of the US into markets where we have higher yields, including South Africa, and that capital flow could be significant over the next 4 years of a Biden presidency. So longer term, emerging markets, which have struggled really again, in the last 10 years against developed markets, could be the beneficiary not only of a Biden victory, but of subsequent events that may take place. If we can go to the next slide very briefly. You can see in a number of surveys, it's come out that Biden won't necessarily be bad for business. And we've seen many of these sort of pieces of commentary. But what happens is often, as it becomes more apparent that something will happen, commentators adjust their commentary to suit this. So I wouldn't pay too much attention to all of this. We've got a saying here at Celerity that if it's in the press, it's in the price. Certainly markets are pricing in that Biden is likely to win, but will markets move up or down sharply if Trump wins? It's very difficult to say, because both of these candidates have both good and bad policies for the US market and for global markets. I think I'll then conclude, and those of you who have a question can start typing it in the Q&A session, and we're not going to handle any political questions. We will certainly talk about one or two investment issues if there are any. But to conclude, it does seem clear that Biden is likely to win this election. It won't be unfathomable that Trump wins. As I said in our Groundhog Day, there are 10 days out of the 100 where we wake up and Trump is in actual fact the president. It may be that he contests that for some time if he loses, and that will bring volatility to markets, but it won't really change market fundamentals. Now, what we do know is that the outcome of the US election will influence the global economy and investment markets. It's not clear whether a Trump or Biden victory will be better for investment returns, but what is clear that any drawn-out process following tomorrow's election will bring volatility to markets. So just be careful. Don't be out of the market on the wrong day when markets go up sharply after a sharp drop. I would certainly not try and time anything around the election outcome. So I wouldn't bet on any specific outcome, even if it looks likely that Biden may win this election. I think there are far more fundamental reasons why one should take specific investment positions and not try and guess the outcome of the US election, even though it does matter for the global economy, as I said earlier. And perhaps then, just in conclusion, the following. Having done some research now in recent weeks about the election, I realized that democracy is the worst form of government, except, of course, for all those other forms that's already been tried. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andries. That was, I think, very insightful and a very clear perspective on the US elections. I think I haven't seen any questions come through that are investment related. But if there are any, I'd like to encourage you to reach out to BDO and to Celerity, and we're happy to deal with those questions. But Andries, thank you so much. Like I said, that was a very clear perspective on what is traditionally a rather complicated and theatrical US election process. And I know that you are certainly our expert in all things investment, including the US elections. And you definitely do know a lot about everything. So we do call you our expert. Andries, thank you for taking time today to be with BDO Wealth Advisors and our clients. We truly value your insights and clarity that you bring to the investment world. I think just following on what Andries has said, regardless of who's in power, the big influence tends to be what's going on in the economy and the markets themselves. And that's where the investment professionals like Celerity Investments help you and I make sense of the strategies for your financial plan. I think it's fair to reflect that financial planning is about making sense of what matters in the world around us and focusing primarily on what you can control. And to be fair, there's a lot that matters in our world, but often there's very little control that we can exercise over these important and often interesting matters, just like the US elections. We can't control who's elected as the next US president, but what does matter, what we can control, are largely our behaviors. How much we save, how we spend, what we spend money on, how long we work, where we work, and how we live. So as your financial planner, BDO Wealth Advisor's role is to help keep you focused on these behaviors so that you make good money decisions. So when in doubt, reach out to BDO and let us help you make sense of the noise around you and put that financial plan into perspective. So I'd like to thank you for making time to join us today. Although we may not have connected in person, I am assured by the counter on my screen that you are there. So thank you for your attendance. Stay safe, stay well, until we meet again. Goodbye.